Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. This week, I watched Coach Carter from 2005. Now, this is a weird pick for me, or in general, for a whole bunch of reasons. But I recall when this movie was in theaters and didn't see it at the time. And weirdly, at the time, it might have appealed to me more than it does now. But this is an interesting movie to reflect on for a whole bunch of reasons. This came across my memory because Channing Tatum, this seems like a jump, but bear with me for a second. Channing Tatum has now become a rather big actor and is obviously has a substantial role in the latest Deadpool film that just came out, and everybody's like giving him props for his acting in that movie, apparently. And I was reminded, oh yeah, Coach Carter was his first ever movie acting role. I've never actually watched Coach Carter. So I felt like I should go back because I've seen clips of this movie before, and it seemed pretty good. This is, it's a sports movie. It's a sports drama movie. And that's a weird thing to talk about from the very beginning for a whole bunch of reasons, both in general and for me. For me, it's just, I'm not a big sports person. I'm less of a big sports person than I used to be many years ago. But that's also not really necessarily the driving force behind people wanting to watch sports movies. There are quite a few good sports movies out there that I think are absolutely worth seeing, even if you have absolutely zero interest in sports. I think Miracle on Ice, of course, is a classic. But this is really interesting because of the time that it came out and how it relates to now. So this coming out nearly 20 years ago now, this was really in the very height of the decline of sports movies. Sports movies are a genre that is not dead, but is very much diminished from what it once was. Throughout the 60s and 70s, there were a number of notable, prestigious sports movies that I really think set a standard for what you could do with a sports-based story. I'm mostly talking about semi-biographical or at least, normal stories, realistic stories about dramatic events surrounding sports events and sports people. As we got into the 80s and the 90s and really up until the early 2000s, that went from being a show of great writing and drama and cinema around a high tension event, usually, or high tension, high stakes kind of thing, to a very played out genre. This really sort of raised to its height near the end of the 90s and into the early 2000s, where the market was just like multiple times a year a new sports movie would come out, and it would be this really overplayed, over dramatized, very hackneyed kind of story. And there were so many problems with it. One was just on the face, almost all of them were marketed to be tear-jerking stories of success, of overcoming things, success, these other things that very dramatic and being proposed as like human interest stories, but ultimately, especially looking back on them now, presented in incredibly cheesy and overplayed ways. At the time, I was already not into them. There were a few that I'd seen and liked, and then there were just so many that I ultimately ended up seeing a bunch more. And most of them, even the ones I thought that other people seem to think are really, really good even these days, I just thought were hackneyed and played out. And so I don't have a great love of sports movies. They also, into the 2000s, really hit on a very bad streak where of both some very aggressive historical revisionism in a couple of cases, where semi-biographical stories were heavily rewritten and then reviewed once they got out, and people went, this isn't like remotely like what the real story was like. You Hollywoodized this to death. Or in a different kind of issue that's sometimes overlapping, there were a bunch of movies that came out that were basically, undeniably, they look like white savior stories. And no matter how true the story may actually be, it's not a good look, especially from Hollywood in the 2000s, to be telling a bunch, like, repeatedly over and over, releasing these sports movies where some, white person leads a black person or a bunch of, people, not white people, to sports victories. It's looking a little racist. And this was really like it was a whole thing. And I can't dig into all the details and the individual cases that were happening, but that really got a lot of attention, primarily because a bunch of those movies got either Oscar nods or won Oscars. And people stared at that and went, like, even if the movies were good, which I didn't think so, but a lot of people did, even the people who thought they were good were like, did this really deserve awards? Probably not. That's a whole sidebar. I've mentioned before my disdain for the Oscars and award ceremonies in general, but I digress. Anyway, sports movies in this era were basically digging their last few shovels worth of earth into the ground before they were basically gone. There are a few notable movies that have come out in the last 15 years that I would qualify as sports movies and actually are quite good, but most of them have basically made a hard split with that entire era of sport drama films because it was a dark era. This comes out at the tail end of that era, and I have to say is a surprise, because it's actually in a lot of ways quite good. For one, it basically avoids all of the issues that I just mentioned. Yes, it is not great cinema. Yes, it is very much riding on a lot of the tropes of sports dramas that preceded it. It is overplayed in some moments, trying to, pump up drama or Hollywood sanitize certain elements of story, or just in a very typical Hollywood fashion, gloss over the realities of, the necessity of the difficulty of achieving certain things. This is a thing I have problems with sports movies all the time, is just the idea that, all we had to do was buckle down and do it, and then we get a sports montage, and at the end, we've succeeded. And this movie is not without its montages of success. But at the same time, it is telling a relatively, for Hollywood, raw story about an unusual set of characters, comparatively speaking, for well, I don't know if I'd say a big budget film, but a moderate budget film. This is actually made by MTV Films. It's distributed by Paramount, apparently. So who knows what's going on behind the scenes and who approved what, but this was not like an indie film. So to have a story that is about a black man going to a impoverished neighborhood where he already lives and mostly teaching other people who are not white, that's already surprising for a 2005 movie of any kind. 2005 was a very, very white era. And even as Oh, we could get into a whole history about how Hollywood slowly but incredibly carefully and sometimes grossly whitewashed a lot of the things that it imported from, for want of a better phrase, black culture in the 90s and 2000s. It did not do a good job. But to have this movie be primarily about non-white characters in a setting that most of the, targeted movie-going audiences by Hollywood standards were probably not going to see themselves in, is a surprise on its own. There's also a ton of beats in this film, in the story, that are a lot grittier and a lot less sort of cleaned up than was typical of stories of Hollywood, written by Hollywood at the time, and especially in sports movies. Sports movies, especially in this era, really had a tendency to have the most synthetic of tensions, and in large ways, very synthetic stakes. The idea behind a sports movie is usually, the overarching framework is usually about a sports achievement of some kind, but usually the core story is more talking about an individual or individuals in that story, and using the sport as direct or indirect metaphor for their own personal growth and the way it allows them to do and interact with other things in their lives. And while this movie is no exception, it's definitely taking a different attitude towards that. This is not saying all you got to do is try. All you got to do is keep your head up. All you got to do is this, that, and the other thing. This is a movie with, especially in the front half of it, some genuine tension, conflict, and some amount of character. Unfortunately, by the end, it comes around to being a lot more formulaic. I was really hopeful in the front half of this film that we were not going to have as many of the typical tropes and beats of the genre that led up to this period. And it definitely does them, a lot of them by the end, but they're kind of okay. Like, at that point, you're invested enough, or I was invested enough in the film, that I think that most of those sins can be forgiven. I'm not going to say that the story is fantastic. I'm not going to say that the characters are fantastic or they're super fleshed out or any of these other things. But this also shirks a tendency from the era for a lot of sports films to be about one or two individuals, often a coach or a singular player, or let's say an entire team, but without any defining individual characters within it. This does, not in great detail, but in some amount of detail, try to highlight each individual character. It's a little blurry how many characters are actually on the team, but we sort of gloss over that. But the number of characters that they've selected to be major speaking roles to fill out the roster, as well as the coach, all having their individual struggles and their individual things that they're going through. And while I would certainly have liked to see more detail delved into, okay, what's each character going through? How do these intersect with each other? Are they actually getting resolution and growth to each of their struggles, etc., etc.? I think it at least does away with a lot of the standards of the genre of drawing a whole team as a unified character, basically, with the only defining features of an individual on the team being they have a banter line at some point. So in a lot of ways, this comes around to being a lot more grounded, a lot more feeling like it's grounded in reality, and a lot more rounded out in terms of its the care taken, I guess, towards telling what feels like a real story. There, in production and casting and all those things, these are the things I think probably made this have its ups and downs in terms of its reach and in terms of its success. We have the star of the movie being Samuel L. Jackson. Obviously, even in 2005, he was an incredibly notable actor, had been for 20 years at that point, I think. And while he's obviously grown even more in the years since, that would have brought a certain amount of cachet to the film from the very start. It's also probably why the name of the film is Coach Carter rather than Richmond High basketball, or whatever they would have named it instead. Because while he is, very much the leading actor, the movie also doesn't make him the sole primary character. This is another pitfall that sports movies often fall into, or often did fall into at the time, of there being a singular character, often the coach, who is the focus of the story, even when they are not the one doing the sports. They're supposed to be, in many ways, somebody who they end up being the character who is struggling on their own, but is also a resource and an inspiration to the team. And that becomes very cliche after the 30th time you've seen it. So in a lot of ways, it gets away from that. That said, Samuel L. Jackson puts on a very good performance in this film, but not a very consistent one. In each individual scene, I think he delivers quite well. As far as painting the idea of a consistent character and one who actually has an arc of his own, that's where it starts to there's a few too many holes and starts to fall apart. And I don't know if this just fell apart in the editing process, if he had more of an arc at some point, but he really comes in as somebody who doesn't have a lot of his own growth, and rather somebody who is there to be that mentor character, like I mentioned, but in a more well-rounded way. One who is not melodramatic, one who is more realistic and flawed in his own ways, and those sorts of things, while also being sort of that catalyst for the story to move, the catalyst for the other characters, and an inspiration. As far as the rest of the cast, nobody in particular stands out to me as being like a great actor, but I think everybody does a pretty good job. There are a bunch of actors. There's a few that had longer careers after this. Obviously, Channing Tatum, but there are a couple of other actors in this film who I saw in a ton. I swear I have to go back and go search through IMDb, who probably throughout the 2000s I saw a ton and have basically, to my knowledge, never seen after that. So this comes from a particular era of movies that's probably the time in my life when I was going to see the most movies in theaters. It was also a time when you could go to see movies in theaters for much less money than you can now. But I digress. I'm old. There are a bunch of people in here who I think do a perfectly good job of their acting roles, and I saw in a bunch of other things. As far as pointing out individual movies, I swear I don't want to list them all off, because I think I know who a bunch of people are, but I didn't actually check. Anyway, I think this movie is surprisingly compelling for being what it is in the era that it came out. And while I recognize that this is not a great movie by any means, I think it does enough to shirk the standards of the genre that I think if you wanted a 90s 2000s style sports film with, a dramatic element to it without being overblown, overly saccharine, and like ridiculously Hollywoodized, I think this does a pretty good job. I'm I'm a little bit surprised how happy I was with this film by the end. And I've mellowed a little bit since I came to the end of it and processed the thing as a whole. And, it's still very much in the genre. It's not making waves. It's not doing something excellent that wasn't appreciated at the time. It's just sort of okay. But it's unique enough that it's worth appreciating. If by some chance you happen to be in the market for exactly that, a 90s or 2000s sports drama, this is not bad at all. Yeah, you could certainly do worse. I don't want to say it has a pacing problem. It does run a little bit long. It is over 2 hours, which is substantial for a sports film. That's usually often a kind of thing that wraps up reasonably quick. But it doesn't drag too much. It has individual scenes that I would have cut or would have shortened, but on the whole, I think the pacing is pretty good as well. Anyway, I digress. I think this is pretty all right. Thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'll see you guys next time.